Hey guys, tonight we're hammering our way into the scorching world of medieval blacksmiths and their grueling daily battles at the forge. These unsung craftsmen faced blistering heat, toxic fumes, and constant danger with nothing but their skill, endurance, and specialized knowledge to keep disaster at bay. From devastating lung conditions to crippling physical injuries, permanent hearing loss to social isolation, their tale is one of remarkable sacrifice and human determination. Before we begin our journey through history's most punishing profession, if you enjoy these nighttime stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community of history lovers. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always wonderful to see our global family connecting through these stories. Now go ahead and dim those lights and settle in as we drift back together to a time when crafting a simple horseshoe could slowly kill you in a dozen different ways. Imagine waking before dawn in a small medieval village, sometime around the year 1350, while most villagers might still be huddled under their blankets for another precious hour of sleep. You, the village blacksmith, are already awake. Your day begins earlier than most, not by choice, but by necessity. The work that lies ahead demands every hour of daylight, and even in summer, those hours never seem enough. Your home, unlike the peasant cottages clustered in the village center, sits slightly apart, a practical necessity, rather than a social statement. The constant danger of fire from your forge makes your neighbors nervous, and rightfully so. In an era of wooden buildings and thatched roofs, a single spark could devastate the entire community. This physical separation is just the first hint of the isolation that comes with your profession, a theme we'll return to throughout our journey tonight. As you rise from your straw mattress, your body already protests with a symphony of aches. At 35, you're considered middle-aged in medieval terms, but your body feels ancient. Your hands, once smooth, are now a landscape of calluses, burns, and tiny embedded metal fragments that glint beneath the skin. Your shoulder joints creak with every movement, worn down by years of repetitive hammering. Your lower back throbs constantly, the result of bending over the anvil day after day, year after year. And then there's your breathing. Even before reaching the forge, your chest feels tight, your lungs never quite filling completely. After 15 years at the forge, the metallic dust and coal particles have begun their insidious work on your respiratory system. Medieval blacksmiths rarely recognized the connection between their profession and their persistent cough, but modern research has revealed the devastating respiratory conditions, silicosis, siderosis, and various forms of pneumoconiosis that plague these craftsmen. But you have no time to dwell on physical discomfort. The village depends on you. Without your skills, plows break and remain broken, horses go unshod, wheels lose their metal rims, and countless tools, from nails to knives, hinges to hammers, cannot be produced or repaired. In the interdependent web of medieval village life, the blacksmith is an essential thread. Your first task is preparing the forge itself. You stir the banked coals from the previous day, carefully preserved overnight, to save precious fuel. Starting a forge from cold would waste valuable charcoal and time. Medieval blacksmiths developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining their fires at minimal cost, banking the coals with ash to slow combustion without extinguishing it completely. This morning ritual of awakening the forge requires experience and judgment. Too aggressive, and you'll waste fuel. Too gentle, and you'll lose precious working time. The best fuel for your forge would be charcoal, which burns hotter and cleaner than raw wood. But charcoal is expensive, produced through a labor-intensive process of controlled wood burning. As a village blacksmith of modest means, you likely use a mixture of charcoal and coal when you can get it, supplemented with wood when necessary. The quality of your fuel directly impacts the quality of your work, another pressure in a profession already filled with them. As you pump the bellows to bring the forge to proper temperature, the first waves of heat wash over you. Even in winter, the area around your forge will soon become unbearably hot. In summer, the conditions are truly hellish. While other villagers might complain about working in the summer heat, few could tolerate the temperatures you endure daily. Hour after hour, you'll stand next to a fire reaching temperatures of over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to turn iron malleable. This constant exposure to extreme heat comes with serious consequences. Dehydration is a constant threat, yet medieval understanding of hydration was limited. The water available to you, typically drawn from wells or streams, might carry parasites and bacteria. Many craftsmen turned to ale or beer as safer alternatives, but these had their own drawbacks, not least their effects on coordination and judgment. Dangerous deficits in a profession where one misplaced hammer blow could mean serious injury. Heat-related illnesses that modern workers would recognize, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, thermal burns, were simply accepted as part of the blacksmith's existence. With no concept of temperature regulation beyond removing layers of clothing itself, dangerous when working with hot metal, or occasionally stepping away from the forge, you endure conditions that modern occupational safety standards would never permit. But perhaps the most insidious effect of the forge's heat is on your eyes. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, you stare into the glowing heart of the fire. The forge's glow is hypnotic and necessary. The color of the metal tells you its temperature and readiness for working. Medieval blacksmiths had no protective eyewear, no concept of the cumulative damage caused by constant exposure to the infrared radiation emitted by white-hot metal. The result? Cataracts forming decades earlier than in the general population, gradual deterioration of visual acuity, and in extreme cases partial blindness in later years. As the forge reaches working temperature, you turn to your first task of the day, perhaps repairing a broken plow blade for a local farmer desperate to return to his fields. The rhythmic dance begins, heating the metal until it glows the proper color, transferring it quickly to the anvil, hammering it into shape while it remains malleable, then returning it to the fire when it cools too much to work. This cycle repeats dozens, sometimes hundreds of times for a single piece. The physical demands are extraordinary. Modern studies of traditional blacksmithing techniques have revealed that the force required for effective forge work often exceeds 40 pounds per hammer blow. A blacksmith might deliver thousands of such blows in a single day. The strain this places on the muscles, tendons, and joints of the arms, shoulders, and back is immense, leading to chronic inflammation, tendon damage, and early onset arthritis. Archaeological examinations of medieval blacksmiths' remains tell this story clearly. Their skeletons show distinctive patterns of wear and damage, overdeveloped muscles on the dominant arm, arthritic changes in the elbow and shoulder joints, compression damage to the spine. Your profession quite literally reshapes your body over time, sacrificing long-term health for the demands of the craft. The dangers extend far beyond chronic conditions. Acute injuries are a constant threat. A moment's inattention, a slip of the hand, fatigue affecting judgment. Any of these can result in devastating injuries. Burns are the most common and range from minor to life-threatening. Hot metal doesn't just burn skin, it sticks to it, continuing to transfer heat deep into tissue. Without modern medical treatment, serious burns frequently led to infection and ultimately death. Other injuries are equally devastating. Metal fragments flying from hammered work can embed themselves in eyes or skin. The hammer itself might miss its target and crush fingers. Heavy pieces being manipulated might fall, breaking bones or causing crushing injuries. In the close quarters of the typical medieval forge, with multiple hazards present simultaneously, the opportunity for injury was constant. Medieval medicine offered little effective treatment for serious forge injuries. Burns might be treated with various herbal preparations. Some, like those containing honey, had legitimate antibacterial properties, while others were useless or harmful. Infections, almost inevitable with serious injuries in a pre-antibiotic era, were often fatal. A serious hand injury could mean not just temporary disability, but the permanent loss of livelihood. There was no workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no social safety net beyond family and community charity. Yet despite these risks, blacksmiths continued their craft, driven by economic necessity and often genuine pride in their skills. The medieval blacksmith occupied a unique position in the social hierarchy, neither a mere laborer nor a member of the elite, but something in between. Your specialized knowledge gave you status that common field workers lacked, yet you remained firmly among the working class, your hands and face perpetually marked by your labor. This ambiguous social position had both advantages and limitations. You likely enjoyed slightly better economic prospects than the average peasant farmer. Blacksmithing required specialized skills that commanded higher compensation than unskilled labor. In many medieval communities, the blacksmith might own his workshop rather than working land belonging to the local lord, providing a measure of independence unusual for the time. However, this economic advantage came with significant startup costs. Establishing a forge required substantial investment in tools, anvils, materials, and the forge itself. These items represented major capital expenditures in a time when most peasants owned little beyond basic household goods and farming implements. Many blacksmiths inherited their tools and knowledge from fathers or masters under whom they had apprenticed, creating family traditions of metalworking that spanned generations. Speaking of apprenticeship, let's consider how one became a blacksmith in medieval times. The training was long, arduous, and often began in childhood. A typical apprenticeship might start around age 12-14 and last for 7-10 years. During this period, the apprentice lived with the master blacksmith, receiving food, shelter, and training in exchange for labor. The relationship was often closer to that of parent and child than employer and employee, with the master responsible for the apprentice's moral as well as technical education. This training period was physically brutal. Young apprentices performed the most menial and exhausting tasks, pumping the bellows for hours on end, a task requiring surprising strength and endurance, hauling fuel and water, cleaning the workshop. Gradually, they would be entrusted with simple metalworking tasks, learning through observation and practice rather than formal instruction. Many apprentices suffered serious injuries during this learning period, and some didn't survive to become journeymen. For those who completed their apprenticeship, the next step was typically to become a journeyman, working for various masters to broaden their skills before potentially establishing their own forge. This period might last several years, and often involve traveling between towns and villages. The term journeyman itself refers to this journey. This travel exposed smiths to different techniques and traditions, but also separated them from home and family, contributing to the social isolation characteristic of the profession. Only after this extensive training and experience might a blacksmith establish his own forge and take on apprentices of his own. The entire process, from beginning apprenticeship to becoming an independent master, might consume 15 to 20 years, a substantial portion of a medieval lifespan. This lengthy training period reflects both the complexity of the skill set required and its crucial importance to medieval society. As the morning progresses and you work through your first tasks, let's consider the technical challenges you face daily. Modern blacksmiths have access to standardized materials, precise temperature measurement, power tools for the most physically demanding tasks, and a scientific understanding of metallurgy. You have none of these advantages. The quality of iron available to a medieval blacksmith varied wildly. Unlike modern steel, with its carefully controlled carbon content, medieval iron might contain various impurities and inconsistent carbon levels. Much of it came from bloomeries, primitive furnaces that produced a spongy mass of iron mixed with slag waste material, rather than the clean ingots modern smiths would recognize. This bloom required extensive working to consolidate the metal and remove impurities, adding hours of labor before the actual crafting could even begin. Temperature control was equally challenging. Without thermometers, you rely entirely on color as a guide to metal temperature. Various shades of red, orange, yellow, and white indicate different temperature ranges, and recognizing these precisely takes years of experience. The consequences of misjudgment can be severe. Metal worked at too low a temperature won't shape properly, while overheated metal can become brittle or even burn. Your tools, while specialized, are primitive by modern standards. The hammer, tongs, and anvil are your primary implements, supplemented by various swages, fullers, and punches for specific tasks. Each must be used with precision born of years of practice. A misplaced hammer blow isn't just inefficient, it can ruin hours of work in an instant. And unlike modern craftsmen, who might simply purchase replacement tools, you likely forge your own, a bootstrap process requiring remarkable skill. The physical workspace itself presents additional challenges. Medieval forges typically had poor ventilation, allowing smoke, coal dust, and metal particles to accumulate in the air. Lighting was inadequate, typically limited to whatever daylight came through small windows or openings, supplemented in darker corners by expensive tallow candles or oil lamps. In winter, when daylight hours were short, your productive time was similarly constrained, forcing an even more intense pace during available hours. By midday, you're several hours into your labor. Your arms ache, your lungs burn, your eyes sting from smoke, and staring at glowing metal, the heat is oppressive, yet you can't afford to stop. The village depends on your output, and your livelihood depends on completing as many pieces as possible. Unlike modern workers with regulated breaks and limited hours, your workday is governed only by daylight and physical endurance. This brings us to another aspect of the blacksmith's life often overlooked in romantic portrayals, the economic pressures that drove the punishing work pace. As a craftsman, you occupied a precarious economic position. Your skills commanded respect and better compensation than unskilled labor, but you were also subject to the same cycles of scarcity that affected the entire medieval economy. Bad harvests, increasingly frequent as the climate cooled during the Little Ice Age beginning in the 14th century, meant less agricultural surplus for everyone. When farmers struggled, they had less to spend on metal goods or repairs. Local lords might delay payment for commissioned work, leaving you with materials costs but no income. Competition from other smiths or traveling tinkers could undercut your business. These economic uncertainties forced many blacksmiths to work additional jobs, perhaps farming a small plot or engaging in other crafts during slower periods. The financial arrangements themselves would seem bizarre by modern standards. Much of your work might be compensated through barter rather than currency, particularly in smaller villages where coins were scarce. A repaired plow blade might be exchanged for a portion of the harvest it helped produce. A set of hinges for the mill might be paid for in flour. This system required complex mental accounting and negotiation skills beyond the technical aspects of metalworking. Pricing itself was a challenge, often governed by local custom rather than simple supply and demand. In many regions, blacksmiths' rates were regulated by guild rules or local authorities, limiting your ability to adjust prices based on the difficulty of work or fluctuating material costs. These economic constraints added another layer of stress to an already physically punishing profession. As afternoon approaches, let's consider another aspect of the medieval blacksmith's life, the social dimensions of the profession. The same factors that gave blacksmiths higher status than ordinary peasants also separated them from mainstream village society. The physical isolation of the forge, the specialized knowledge that few others understood, the visible markers of the profession, burns, calluses, perpetually dirty hands and face, all contributed to a certain social distance. This separation was amplified by superstition and religious associations. Metalworking, with its transformation of raw materials through fire, has carried mystical associations in virtually every culture. In medieval Europe, despite the official Christian framework, blacksmiths were often viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion. The ability to tame fire and transform solid metal seemed magical to many observers, and old pagan associations lingered in popular imagination. These supernatural associations manifested in various ways. In some regions, blacksmiths were thought to have healing powers, particularly for certain ailments. A child might be passed through an iron hoop, forged by the smith to cure rickets. A smith-made nail might be used in folk remedies. Conversely, The profession was sometimes associated with the devil. After all, what could be more hellish than working with fire all day? These contradictory beliefs further isolated smiths from their communities, marking them as different, other. The physical demands of the profession also limited social participation. After a day at the forge, you likely lack the energy for village gatherings or celebrations. Your irregular working hours, starting before others wake, sometimes continuing after dark with urgent work, mean your schedule rarely aligns with community rhythms. Over time, this creates a subtle but real separation from the social fabric that sustains other villagers. This isolation could have psychological consequences. Modern research on occupational psychology suggests that social connection is crucial for mental well-being, particularly in physically demanding jobs. Medieval blacksmiths, lacking this support while enduring extreme physical conditions, likely suffered what we would now recognize as occupational stress, burnout, and in some cases, depression. Without modern concepts of mental health or treatments for these conditions, they simply endured, perhaps finding some solace in ale or in the meditative aspects of their craft. The Smith's family shared some of these burdens. Your spouse, almost certainly a wife, as female blacksmiths were extremely rare though not entirely unheard of, would likely assist with aspects of the business, perhaps managing accounts, handling customers, or performing secondary tasks in the forge. Children might be enlisted as helpers from an early age, particularly in pumping the bellows, a task requiring little skill but considerable endurance. Living with a blacksmith brought unique hardships. The constant risk of fire meant anxiety about the family's physical safety and economic security. The physical toll of the work meant watching a spouse age prematurely, develop chronic health problems, and potentially become disabled through accident or cumulative strain. The social separation extended to the entire family, marking them as different in the close-knit village community. As we approach late afternoon in our day at the medieval forge, the physical toll becomes increasingly apparent. Modern studies of traditional blacksmithing have measured core body temperatures rising to dangerous levels after hours of forge work. Without understanding of proper hydration or electrolyte replacement, you're likely experiencing symptoms of heat stress, dizziness, fatigue, decreased coordination, impaired judgment, precisely when working with dangerous materials and tools. The noise of the forge compounds the physical stress. The ringing of hammer on anvil, repeated thousands of times daily, produces sound levels that modern occupational standards would classify as hazardous. Without hearing protection, medieval blacksmiths commonly developed significant hearing loss, a condition preserved in the skeletons of some smiths, whose ear bones show distinctive damage patterns. This hearing damage further isolated smiths from their communities, limiting communication and social participation. The air quality in the forge deteriorates throughout the day, as smoke, coal dust, and metal particles accumulate. Modern measurements in reconstructed medieval forges have found particulate levels hundreds of times higher than current safety standards would allow. Each breath draws these contaminants deeper into your lungs, contributing to the chronic respiratory conditions virtually universal among long-practicing smiths. Despite these accumulating stresses, you must maintain precise focus and technical skill. As the day progresses, you might transition from utilitarian items, nails, hinges, agricultural implements, to more specialized work, perhaps a sword for the local lord, decorative ironwork for the church, or surgical tools for the barber surgeon. These higher value items require greater precision and artistry, demanding your best work when your body is most depleted. This contradiction, the need for peak performance under physically depleting conditions, represents one of the central paradoxes of the blacksmith's craft. Modern ergonomics and occupational health recognize the relationship between physical condition and work quality. Medieval blacksmiths had no such framework, only the practical knowledge that mistakes late in the day were more common and potentially more costly. As evening approaches, you face decisions about concluding the day's work. Banking the forge fire properly is essential. Allowing it to die completely means starting from cold the next morning, wasting precious fuel and time, while leaving it to active risks overnight fires. This judgment, like so many aspects of the craft, comes from experience rather than formal instruction, another example of the embodied knowledge that defined the profession. The day's end brings little relief. Your body, pushed to extremes for 12 to 14 hours, now faces the transition from extreme heat to the ambient temperature. This thermal shock, going from the forge's intense heat to normal conditions, creates its own physical stress. Modern blacksmiths recognize the importance of gradual cooling down periods. Their medieval counterparts typically had no such understanding, subjecting their bodies to yet another form of stress. Cleaning up after the day's work is itself a significant task. Tools must be properly stored, the workspace organized for tomorrow's labors, finished pieces secured for customer pickup. Your hands, stiff from hours of gripping hammer and tongs, struggle with these detailed tasks. Your back, already aching from bending over the anvil, protests as you sweep debris and organize materials. Finally, as darkness falls, you can attempt to clean yourself, a challenge given the limited bathing facilities typical of medieval villages. The soot, sweat and metal particles that coat your skin resist casual washing. The black grime embedded in your skin and under your nails marks you visibly as a smith, a physical manifestation of your professional identity that you carry into every social interaction. Even after washing, your hands remain permanently darkened, your forearms mapped with small burn scars, your persona defined by your labor. Evening meals in a blacksmith's household might differ somewhat from those of other villagers. The extreme physical demands of forge work require substantial caloric intake. Modern studies suggest traditional blacksmithing burns approximately 250–400 calories per hour, meaning a full day at the forge might require 3,000–5,000 calories for replacement. In the often food-insecure medieval world, maintaining this level of nutrition represented a significant challenge. Your slightly higher economic status might allow for somewhat better nutrition than the average peasant, perhaps more frequent meat consumption, or greater quantities of bread and ale. However, medieval diets generally lacked the protein and nutrient density to fully support such intense physical labor, leading to gradual depletion of bodily resources over years of practice. Even rest brought limited relief. Sleep would be disturbed by the accumulated pains of the day, the persistently tender hands, the aching back and shoulders, the burning lungs, the eyes still seeing after images of glowing metal when closed. Modern sleep researchers recognize the impact of physical pain on sleep quality. Medieval blacksmiths simply endured these disruptions without understanding their physiological basis or having effective treatments. Morning would come too soon, beginning the cycle again. The early awakening, the rekindling of the forge, the physical demands, the social isolation, the economic pressures. Day after day, season after season, year after year, the pattern repeats, gradually reshaping your body and diminishing your health. The medieval blacksmith's career was a slow-motion sacrifice of physical well-being for economic survival and community necessity. This grim reality contrasts sharply with romantic portrayals of blacksmithing in popular culture. Modern depictions often emphasize the creative aspects of the craft while minimizing its physical toll. The blacksmith appears as a strong, stoic figure, powerful rather than damaged, commanding rather than constrained. These portrayals capture elements of truth, the smith's strength, skill, and social standing, while eliding the brutal realities of medieval forge work. The disparity between these romantic images and historical reality reveals something important about how we conceptualize historical professions more broadly. We tend to focus on status, skill, and visible products while overlooking the embodied experience of historical labor, the way work literally shaped and often damaged bodies over time. This selective memory creates a distorted understanding of historical life and work. As we near the halfway point in our exploration of the medieval blacksmith's life, we focused primarily on the physical and social challenges of the profession. But there's another dimension we've only touched on briefly: the intellectual demands of the craft. Despite lacking formal scientific understanding, medieval blacksmiths developed and preserved sophisticated empirical knowledge about metallurgy, physics, and engineering. Consider the complexity of even seemingly simple tasks. Creating a functional agricultural tool, a plow blade for instance, required understanding of soil dynamics, stress points, appropriate hardness for different sections of the implement, and the specific needs of local agricultural conditions. This knowledge wasn't theoretical but practical, embodied in techniques passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and guided practice. More complex items required even greater knowledge. A sword, for example, needed flexibility to avoid breaking under impact while maintaining a hard edge, cutting properties that seem contradictory but could be achieved through sophisticated heat treatment techniques. The blacksmith needed to understand how different heating and cooling regimes affected the metal's internal structure, despite having no concept of crystalline arrangements or carbon migration. This sophisticated craft knowledge represents one of the most impressive aspects of medieval blacksmithing: the development and transmission of complex technical understanding without the frameworks of modern science. The blacksmith's knowledge was no less valid or valuable for being practical rather than theoretical, demonstrating the power of empirical observation and iterative improvement over generations. In the next segment of our journey, we'll explore additional dimensions of the medieval blacksmith's life, the specific health conditions associated with long-term forge work, the blacksmith's role during times of warfare and social upheaval, and the ways in which the profession evolved over the medieval period. We'll also examine how blacksmiths navigated the complex religious and social changes of the era, from the dominance of the Catholic Church to the disruptions of the Protestant Reformation. For now, as we pause in our exploration, consider the medieval blacksmith's contradictory position: essential yet isolated, respected yet physically broken, knowledgeable yet lacking theoretical frameworks to explain that knowledge. This ambiguity defines not just the blacksmith's experience, but much of medieval life more broadly, challenging our tendency towards simplified historical narratives that emphasize either the nobility or the misery of pre-modern existence. The medieval blacksmith's story reveals a more complex truth: that historical people navigated difficult constraints with remarkable ingenuity, accepted physical hardships we would find intolerable, and developed sophisticated understanding through practical experience rather than formal theory. Their lives were neither simple nor romantic, but rather fully human in their complexity, contradiction, and compromise. As we continue our exploration of the medieval blacksmith's life, let's delve deeper into the specific health conditions that plagued these essential craftsmen. Modern occupational medicine gives us insights into the cumulative physical damage that forge work inflicted on the human body, damage that medieval smiths simply accepted as an inevitable part of their profession. Perhaps the most insidious health impacts were respiratory conditions. Medieval forges, with their poor ventilation and constant production of smoke, coal dust, and metal particles, created an environment that systematically destroyed lung function over time. Modern research has identified several specific conditions that would have been common among blacksmiths, though they lacked names for these diseases in medieval times. Siderosis, sometimes called blacksmith's lung, results from the inhalation of iron oxide particles produced during the heating and hammering of metal. These particles accumulate in lung tissue, causing inflammation, scarring, and gradually diminishing lung capacity. The condition develops slowly, with symptoms often not becoming noticeable until significant damage has occurred. typically a persistent cough, shortness of breath during exertion, and eventually, chronic bronchitis. Silicosis presented another threat, caused by inhaling silica dust released from coal, certain types of rock used in forge construction, and from the sand, sometimes used in specific metalworking processes. Silica particles cause progressive and irreversible scarring of lung tissue, eventually leading to significant breathing difficulties. Combined with the physical demands of forge work, this reduced lung capacity would have been particularly debilitating. Carbon monoxide poisoning represented a more acute danger. The incomplete combustion of coal and charcoal in poorly ventilated spaces produces this odorless, colorless gas that binds to hemoglobin in the blood more readily than oxygen. While severe poisoning could cause immediate collapse and death, chronic low-level exposure, almost certainly common in medieval forges, produces headaches, dizziness, confusion, and nausea. These symptoms would have been particularly dangerous in a profession requiring precise movements around extremely hot materials. The respiratory burden wasn't limited to the forge itself. Medieval towns and villages, with their open cooking fires, limited waste management, and general pollution, already imposed significant respiratory challenges. The blacksmith's occupational exposure came on top of this baseline, accelerating lung damage and likely reducing lifespans significantly. Archaeological evidence suggests that chronic lung disease was probably the most common cause of premature death among blacksmiths, who avoided fatal accidents. Moving beyond respiratory issues, let's consider the musculoskeletal impacts of forge work. The repetitive motions of hammering, combined with awkward postures maintained for hours, created distinctive patterns of physical damage. Archaeological remains of medieval blacksmiths show hypertrophy, overdevelopment of the muscles and bones in the dominant arm, often accompanied by degenerative changes in the elbow, shoulder, and wrist joints. Modern biomechanical analysis helps us understand why these changes occurred. A typical hammering motion places enormous stress on the elbow joint, particularly the articulation between the humerus and ulna. The repeated impact of the hammer hitting the anvil sends shockwaves up the arm, gradually damaging the joint surfaces. This damage manifests as osteoarthritis, characterized by pain, stiffness, and eventually, reduced range of motion. The shoulder joint suffered similarly. The combination of repetitive movement and the need to manipulate heavy materials placed tremendous strain on the rotator cuff, the group of muscles and tendons that stabilize the shoulder. Rotator cuff injuries, which would have been essentially untreatable in medieval times, cause significant pain and functional limitation. Once damaged, these structures never fully recover without modern surgical intervention, meaning a medieval smith would simply endure progressively worsening shoulder function throughout his career. Lower back problems were equally common. Blacksmithing requires frequent bending over the anvil, often while manipulating heavy objects in extended positions. This places enormous strain on the lumbar spine, particularly the intervertebral discs and supporting muscles. Modern studies of traditional blacksmiths have documented rates of lumbar disc herniation and chronic lower back pain far exceeding the general population. Medieval smiths, lacking even basic understanding of proper lifting techniques or ergonomics, would have been even more vulnerable to these injuries. Hand and wrist problems presented additional challenges. The combination of repetitive gripping of tools, exposure to vibration from hammering, and frequent contact with hot materials created conditions ideal for developing carpal tunnel syndrome, compression of the median nerve as it passes through the wrist. This condition causes pain, numbness, and weakness in the hand, particularly the thumb and first 3 fingers. These symptoms would have been especially problematic in a profession requiring manual dexterity and precise movements. Beyond these chronic conditions, acute injuries were a constant threat. Burns represented the most obvious danger. Contact with hot metal, sparks, or even the ambient heat of the forge caused injuries ranging from minor first-degree burns to devastating third-degree burns that destroyed multiple tissue layers. Without effective treatment, serious burns frequently became infected, leading to potentially fatal complications. The eyes faced particular danger. Flying metal fragments, sparks, and the intense light from hot metal all presented hazards to unprotected eyes. Corneal injuries from embedded metal fragments or chemical burns from forge compounds were essentially untreatable in medieval times, often leading to partial or complete blindness. The cumulative damage from years of staring at bright hot metal likely contributed to early onset cataracts and other degenerative eye conditions. Hearing damage, while less immediately obvious than other injuries, accumulated inexorably throughout a blacksmith's career. Modern measurements in reconstructed medieval forges have recorded sustained noise levels well above 85 decibels, the threshold at which hearing protection is required under contemporary occupational safety standards. The repetitive impact of metal on metal, occurring thousands of times daily, gradually destroyed the delicate structures of the inner ear, leading to progressive hearing loss that further isolated smiths from their communities. These occupational hazards were compounded by the general health challenges of medieval life. Nutrition was often inadequate, particularly in protein and certain vitamins, limiting the body's ability to repair damage. Infectious diseases circulated widely, placing additional stress on systems already compromised by occupational exposures. Medical care, when available, was often ineffective or actively harmful, failing to address underlying conditions while sometimes introducing new complications. The combined effect of these health impacts was a pattern of premature aging and disability among blacksmiths. While a successful smith might achieve relative economic security, his body typically paid a severe price for this accomplishment. Many would have been forced to reduce their workload significantly by their 40s, still needing income but increasingly unable to perform the most demanding aspects of their craft. Some transitioned to lighter metal work or training apprentices, while others likely became dependent on family members or community charity as their health failed. Let's shift our focus now to another aspect of the medieval blacksmith's life: their role during times of conflict and social upheaval. War was a recurring feature of medieval life, ranging from localized skirmishes between rival lords to large-scale conflicts involving multiple kingdoms. During these periods, the blacksmith's skills took on heightened importance and brought additional pressures. The most obvious wartime demand was for weapons and armor. While specialized armories existed in larger cities to supply armies, local blacksmiths were often pressed into service producing or repairing weapons for local lords and militia. This work required specific knowledge and techniques beyond everyday smithing, understanding the proper hardening for sword edges, the weight distribution for effective weapons, and the balance between durability and weight for armor components. These wartime production demands often came with intense pressure, unrealistic deadlines, and the threat of punishment for failure to meet quotas. Medieval legal records contain numerous accounts of blacksmiths punished for failing to meet production requirements during conflicts, ranging from fines to imprisonment or forced labor. The smith's specialized knowledge made him both valuable and vulnerable during wartime, too essential to lose, yet subject to extraordinary demands under difficult circumstances. Beyond direct military production, war created secondary demands as well. Agricultural tools needed to be repaired and replaced at accelerated rates to compensate for reduced farm labor as men were called to fight. Draft animals required more frequent shoeing due to increased transportation of supplies. Everyday items damaged during conflict needed repair. These escalating demands arrived precisely when resources became more scarce. Metal supplies might be requisitioned for military purposes, fuel became harder to obtain, and food prices typically rose during conflicts. The blacksmith's workshop itself could become a target during times of conflict. As a strategic resource, A forge might be destroyed by enemy forces to deprive a region of metalworking capabilities. Alternatively, invading forces might seize control of forges to support their own military needs. The smith and his family, trapped between these competing interests, faced difficult choices with potentially fatal consequences regardless of which side they supported. Social upheavals beyond warfare also impacted blacksmiths in distinctive ways. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, created both opportunities and challenges for surviving craftsmen. The sudden population decline created labor shortages that potentially increased the value of skilled trades, including blacksmithing. Simultaneously, the economic disruption reduced demand for many goods and services, creating a complex and unpredictable market for metalwork. Religious changes throughout the medieval period also affected blacksmiths. The transition from pagan traditions to Christianity, while largely complete by the high medieval period, left lingering associations between metalworking and older spiritual beliefs. Later, the Protestant Reformation created new tensions, particularly around the production of religious items, altar furnishings, decorative elements for churches, and devotional objects that were viewed differently by Catholic and Protestant authorities. These external pressures added another layer of complexity to the already challenging life of the medieval blacksmith. Beyond the physical demands and health risks of the profession itself, smiths needed to navigate changing social, economic, and political landscapes that could dramatically impact their livelihoods and personal safety. This required intelligence, adaptability, and political awareness well beyond the technical aspects of their craft. Now, let's explore how the blacksmith's profession evolved throughout the medieval period. While we've been discussing medieval blacksmithing as though it were a static occupation, the reality encompassed significant changes in technology, organization, and status between the early medieval period, roughly 500 most 1000 CE, and the late medieval era, approximately 1300 to 1500 CE. In the early medieval period, following the collapse of Roman administrative and economic systems, metalworking became more localized and rudimentary in many regions. Techniques preserved from Roman times were maintained in some areas, particularly the Byzantine Empire and parts of the Islamic world, but much of Western Europe experienced a simplification of metalworking practices. Village blacksmiths during this period typically produced basic utilitarian items with limited specialization. As Europe gradually recovered from the post-Roman economic contraction, blacksmithing became increasingly sophisticated. By the High Middle Ages, approximately 1000 to 1300 CE, specialization had increased significantly. While general blacksmiths still existed in smaller villages, larger towns might support multiple specialized metal workers, bladesmiths focusing on edged tools and weapons, farriers specializing in horseshoes and equine equipment, armorers producing protective gear, and locksmiths creating increasingly complex security devices. This specialization reflected both technological advancement and market development. Growing urbanization created concentrated demand for specialized metal goods, while improving economic conditions supported craftsmen focusing on narrower product ranges. For blacksmiths with appropriate skills and geographic placement, these changes could provide improved economic opportunities and social status. However, for those in rural areas or lacking specialized knowledge, competition from these focused craftsmen represented a potential threat to livelihood. The organization of metalworking trades also evolved significantly. In the early medieval period, most blacksmiths operated independently, perhaps with family members and apprentices, but with minimal formal organization. By the High Middle Ages, urban crafts increasingly organized into guilds, formal associations that regulated training, quality standards, pricing, and membership in the profession. These guilds provided certain protections and benefits for members while imposing significant constraints on how they operated. Guild regulations typically specified the length of apprenticeships, the qualifications for becoming a journeyman or master, the quality standards for various products, and sometimes even the prices that could be charged. These rules protected established craftsmen from undercutting by newcomers, but also limited innovation and entrepreneurship. For blacksmiths operating within guild systems, these regulations represented a trade-off, greater security and status in exchange for reduced autonomy. Rural blacksmiths, however, typically remained outside formal guild structures. Their work continued to span a broad range of products and services, adapted to local agricultural and domestic needs. This difference between urban, specialized, guild-organized metal workers and rural generalist independent blacksmiths created divergent experiences and challenges within what we broadly consider medieval blacksmithing. Technological changes further shaped the evolution of the profession. Improvements in furnace design gradually increased the temperatures that could be achieved, allowing for better metal refining and more sophisticated alloys. Water power, increasingly harnessed for industrial purposes from the 12th century onward, allowed for mechanical hammers and bellows that reduced some of the most physically demanding aspects of the work, though these innovations were primarily available in larger operations rather than typical village forges. These technological improvements brought new possibilities, but also new competitive pressures. Blacksmiths, with access to advanced equipment, could produce certain items more efficiently and of higher quality than those using traditional methods. This created economic stratification within the trade, with some smiths prospering through adoption of new techniques, while others struggled to compete using older methods. By the late medieval period, some blacksmiths had evolved into what we might recognize as early industrialists, operating workshops with multiple employees, specialized equipment, and relatively large-scale production. Others remained closer to the traditional model of independent craftsmen, serving local needs with general skills. This diversity of practice makes generalizations about the medieval blacksmith increasingly difficult as we move toward the end of the period. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century, created additional disruption and transformation within the metalworking trades. The sudden population decline dramatically reduced the available workforce, while creating inheritance situations that sometimes allowed journeymen to acquire workshops and tools earlier than would normally have been possible. The resulting reorganization accelerated some changes in how blacksmithing operated while temporarily reversing others. One consistent aspect throughout these changes was the physical toll the work took on practitioners. While technological improvements gradually reduced some demands, mechanical hammers decreased the need for continuous manual hammering. For instance, the fundamental hazards of heat, smoke, noise, and heavy materials remained. In some ways, technological advancements may have even increased certain risks, as higher furnace temperatures created greater potential for severe burns, and more complex alloys sometimes involved more toxic components. The status of blacksmiths within medieval society showed similar complexity and evolution. In the early medieval period, particularly in Northern Europe, metalworkers sometimes held special legal status reflecting their essential role and the mysterious nature of their craft. Early medieval law codes occasionally specified different compensation for injuries to blacksmiths compared to other craftsmen, recognizing their particular importance to community survival. By the High Middle Ages, this special status had generally been absorbed into the broader guild-based organization of urban trades. Within that structure, metalworkers typically ranked among the more prestigious crafts, though below gold and silversmiths who worked with precious metals. Rural blacksmiths, operating outside guild structures, derived their status more directly from local importance and individual reputation rather than formal recognition. Throughout the medieval period, blacksmiths maintained an ambiguous relationship with military power. Their skills could produce weapons and armor, making them potentially dangerous to ruling authorities. Simultaneously, these same skills made them essential for military preparedness. This tension led to various attempts to control metal workers, restricting their movement, requiring registration with local authorities, or limiting what they could produce without specific permission. These controls represented another constraint on blacksmiths' autonomy and another source of precarity in their social position. The religious dimensions of blacksmithing also evolved throughout the medieval period. The early association between metalworking and pagan deities gradually transformed into Christian frameworks, with Saint Eligius, also known as Saint Eloi, emerging as the patron saint of blacksmiths and other metalworkers. Guild-organized smiths would celebrate his feast day December 1st with special masses and sometimes processions displaying their craft. These religious observances provided community recognition and spiritual meaning to the physical hardships of the profession. However, the supernatural associations never entirely disappeared. Folk beliefs about blacksmiths' special powers to heal certain ailments or ward off evil persisted alongside official Christian teachings. These beliefs could provide additional income through side practices of folk healing or charm making, but also created potential tensions with church authorities suspicious of practices outside their control. Medieval blacksmiths thus navigated a complex spiritual landscape, officially Christian but with lingering alternative associations. As we approach the end of the medieval period, we see blacksmithing poised at a transition point. The increasing scale of production, growth of international trade, and early development of banking and financial systems were creating conditions for the eventual transformation of craft production into industrial manufacturing. While this transition would not fully manifest until well after the medieval period, its early stirrings were already visible in the most advanced metalworking operations of the 15th century. For individual blacksmiths, these broader economic changes created a landscape of both opportunity and threat. Those with capital, connections, and willingness to adapt could potentially build larger operations employing multiple workers. Those lacking these advantages faced increasing competition and potential marginalization. This economic uncertainty added yet another layer of stress to a profession already characterized by physical hardship, health risks, and social complexity. Throughout these evolutions in technology, organization, and status, one element remained consistent: the embodied nature of the knowledge required. Despite gradually increasing theoretical understanding of metallurgy and engineering, blacksmithing remained fundamentally a craft learned through physical practice rather than textual instruction. The knowledge resided in the smith's hands, eyes, and practiced judgment more than in any written documentation. This embodied knowledge represented both strength and vulnerability. It allowed masters to maintain control over their craft, requiring aspiring smiths to undergo lengthy apprenticeships rather than simply reading instructions. It created barriers to entry that protected established practitioners. However, it also meant that knowledge could be lost through disruptions in the master-apprentice chain, deaths, wars, plagues, or economic dislocations that prevented normal transmission between generations. The medieval blacksmith thus carried not just the physical burdens of the forge, but also the responsibility of preserving and transmitting a crucial body of practical knowledge that communities depended upon for their agricultural tools, household items, weapons, and countless other metal necessities. This role as knowledge bearer added another dimension to the already complex position of the blacksmith within medieval society. As we pause in our exploration of the medieval blacksmith's world, we've seen how this essential craftsman navigated multiple forms of hardship: physical damage from the work itself, economic uncertainty from changing market conditions, social complexity from ambiguous status, and technological transitions that both created opportunities and threatened traditional practices. The blacksmith story encapsulates broader patterns of medieval life: the close relationship between physical labor and social identity, the embodied nature of knowledge, and the complex interweaving of economic, religious, and social essential dimensions of daily existence. In our next segment, we'll examine the domestic life of medieval blacksmiths, their family relationships, household economics, and living arrangements. We'll also explore how blacksmiths aged and retired in a world without formal pension systems or retirement communities. Finally, we'll consider the broader historical significance of blacksmiths as technological innovators whose work laid foundations for later industrial developments. Through these additional perspectives, we'll gain an even more nuanced understanding of this crucial but physically punishing medieval profession. Having explored the professional challenges and physical hardships of medieval blacksmithing, let's now turn our attention to the domestic sphere. The smith's home life was inextricably intertwined with his work in ways that modern professionals, with our clear separation between workplace and home, might find difficult to imagine. This integration created distinctive patterns of family dynamics, household economics, and living arrangements that further shaped the blacksmith's experience. For most medieval blacksmiths, particularly in smaller communities, the forge and dwelling existed in close proximity, often as connected structures or different sections of the same building. This arrangement arose from practical necessity, the need to protect the valuable tools and materials of the trade, the advantage of heating a living space adjacent to the forge in winter months, and the economic efficiency of maintaining a single property rather than separate work and living spaces. This physical proximity meant that the sensory experiences of the forge, the heat, noise, smoke, and grime, pervaded the blacksmith's domestic life as well. Family members lived with the constant soundtrack of hammer on anvil, the smell of coal and hot metal, and the inevitable infiltration of soot and metal particles into living spaces. The forge's demands shaped household routines, meal times, and social patterns for the entire family, not just the smith himself. The blacksmith's spouse played a crucial role in both domestic and professional spheres. While direct participation in forge work was uncommon for women, though not entirely unknown, the smith's wife typically managed multiple aspects of the business, keeping accounts, handling customer interactions, managing apprentices' domestic needs, and sometimes performing finishing work on metal items. This partnership was economic as much as marital, with the success of the forge depending on both partners' contributions. This integration of roles came with significant challenges. The smith's wife faced the same environmental exposures, though perhaps less intense, as her husband, with similar long-term health implications. She navigated the same social complexities arising from the blacksmith's ambiguous status, and she often bore primary responsibility for childcare and household management alongside her contributions to the business, creating substantial workloads and competing demands. Children in a blacksmith's household were incorporated into the family enterprise from an early age. Sons typically began informal apprenticeship by age 7 or 8, starting with simple tasks like pumping bellows or sorting materials, before gradually learning more complex aspects of the craft. Daughters assisted with domestic management and business operations, developing skills that would serve them either in marriage to another craftsman or occasionally in operating businesses of their own. This early integration into family labor wasn't unique to blacksmithing. Most medieval children contributed to family economic activities from a young age. However, the dangers specific to metalworking created additional risks for children in a blacksmith's household. Burns, eye injuries from flying sparks, and lung damage from continuous exposure to forge smoke and particulates threatened children's health from their earliest years, potentially causing cumulative damage well before formal apprenticeship began. For sons who followed their fathers into blacksmithing, the family connection offered advantages beyond early technical training. They inherited not just physical tools and equipment, but also customer relationships, business reputation, and sometimes guild membership rights, that would have been difficult and expensive to establish independently. This inheritance of social and economic capital helped maintain family businesses across generations, despite the physical toll the work took on individual practitioners. However, the family transmission of the trade also meant that sons inherited the same occupational health risks as their fathers, often beginning exposure to hazardous conditions earlier than non-family apprentices. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows multiple generations of male skeletons with the same distinctive patterns of physical damage: enlarged arm bones, arthritic shoulder and elbow joints, and evidence of lung disease, testifying to the inheritance of both craft and its bodily consequences. The blacksmith's household economy operated differently from those of agricultural families who formed the majority of medieval populations. While most peasants lived with significant seasonal variations in work demands and food availability, the blacksmith's income followed different patterns. Demand for his services might actually increase during agricultural off-seasons, when farmers had time to commission or repair tools. This counter-cyclical pattern created some economic stability, but also meant that periods of rest common in agricultural communities were often unavailable to smiths. This distinctive economic pattern affected everything from food storage strategies to marriage arrangements. Blacksmithing families typically relied more heavily on purchased food rather than self-production, making them more vulnerable to market fluctuations but less dependent on successful harvests. Their slightly higher and more consistent income allowed for greater material comfort than most peasant households achieved, though still far below aristocratic or wealthy merchant standards. Becoming a blacksmith required substantial initial investment in tools, facilities, materials, and training, creating barriers to entry that helped maintain the craft's economic value but also limited social mobility. Most new blacksmiths came from existing smith families or had accumulated resources through extended journeyman periods. This pattern reinforced the hereditary nature of the profession and contributed to the social separation of smithing families from the broader community. The domestic architecture of blacksmithing families reflected both their intermediate economic status and their specific needs. Their homes were typically larger than those of agricultural laborers but not extravagant. The need to accommodate apprentices, who traditionally lived with their masters, required additional space. The constant influx of soot and metal particulates from the nearby forge influenced interior arrangements and cleaning practices. The specialized requirements for storing valuable tools and materials affected security measures and spatial organization. Archaeological excavations of medieval blacksmiths' dwellings reveal these distinctive patterns: slightly larger than average living spaces, evidence of multiple occupants beyond the nuclear family, likely apprentices, specialized storage areas for materials, and often a higher concentration of metal objects than found in typical households. These homes existed at the intersection of domestic life and industrial production, creating unique challenges and arrangements. For blacksmiths fortunate enough to achieve economic stability, the question of retirement eventually arose: how to manage the transition when physical capabilities declined, but financial needs continued. Unlike modern workers with pension systems or retirement savings plans, medieval craftsmen relied primarily on family support in their later years. The most common pattern involved a gradual transition of heavy work to sons or advanced apprentices, while the aging smith focused on lighter tasks, customer relations, or specialized work requiring experience more than physical strength. This transition typically occurred without formal arrangements or clear delineation. A smith simply performed less of the physically demanding work as his body became less capable, often continuing some level of participation in the forge well into what we would consider old age. This gradual reduction rather than complete cessation of work reflected both economic necessity and the central role the craft played in the smith's identity and social position. For smiths without sons to continue the business, the options were more limited. Some arranged for former apprentices to take over their forges, sometimes with agreements to provide continued support for the retiring smith and his wife. Others sold their tools and equipment to fund their later years, transitioning to whatever lighter work their health and local opportunities permitted. In the worst cases, those who could no longer work and lacked family support might rely on church charity or community assistance, a precarious and often inadequate safety net. The smith's wife faced similar challenges of aging, often compounded by widowhood. Blacksmiths' physically demanding work and exposure to hazardous conditions likely contributed to higher than average rates of premature death or disability. Archaeological evidence suggests their life expectancy was somewhat lower than even the modest medieval average. This left many smiths' wives to manage alone in their later years, either continuing to operate the business with hired help or journeymen, or transitioning it to sons or other relatives. Widows of blacksmiths occupied an interesting position in medieval economic structures. While most crafts restricted full participation to men, widows were often permitted to continue their husbands' businesses, at least temporarily. This exception recognized both the practical knowledge women gained through years of partnership in the enterprise and the economic necessity of maintaining essential services in communities. Some widow-operated forges thrived for years, particularly when the widow had sons approaching the age of full qualification or could hire journeymen to handle the most physically demanding tasks. Beyond the immediate family, blacksmiths maintained complex relationships with apprentices who occupied an intermediate position between employee and family member. Living in the master's household, apprentices were subject to his discipline and authority in both professional and personal matters. Masters were expected to provide not just technical training but moral guidance, treating apprentices somewhat as additional children under their protection and control. This arrangement created distinctive household dynamics. Apprentices contributed labor to both the forge and domestic chores while requiring food, shelter, and supervision. They represented both current assistance and future competition, particularly if they established independent forges in the same region after completing their training. The presence of adolescent males not related by blood created potential tensions but also expanded the household's productive capacity and social connections. The relationship between masters and apprentices was governed by contracts that specified terms of service, training obligations, and behavioral expectations. These arrangements varied widely in their formality, from guild-approved written contracts in larger towns to verbal agreements witnessed by community members in rural areas. However structured, these agreements typically provided limited protections for apprentices while granting masters substantial authority. Abuse within these relationships was not uncommon. Historical records contain numerous accounts of excessive physical discipline, exploitation through excessive work unrelated to training, inadequate provision of food or clothing, and failure to teach the promised skills. Guild records from larger towns include cases of apprentices fleeing abusive masters, masters being sanctioned for mistreatment, and disputes over contract terms. Rural apprentices with less institutional oversight were potentially more vulnerable to exploitation. Yet successful master-apprentice relationships could develop into quasi-familial bonds lasting throughout both parties' lives. Former apprentices might maintain connections with their masters' families, provide support in old age, continue business relationships, or even marry into the family. These ongoing connections created extended networks that functioned somewhat like kinship groups, providing mutual assistance and social solidarity for those within the craft tradition. The gender dynamics within blacksmithing households reflected broader medieval patterns while incorporating craft-specific elements. The physical strength required for heavy forge work reinforced male dominance in the central technical aspects of the craft. However, the integrated nature of home and workshop created opportunities for women's participation in business operations, customer management, and sometimes specific technical processes requiring dexterity more than strength. Women's contributions to blacksmithing enterprises, though essential, typically received less formal recognition than men's work. Guild regulations rarely acknowledged female participation. Historical records underrepresent women's roles, and artistic depictions of blacksmithing almost exclusively show male figures. This pattern of invisible or undervalued female labor parallels broader trends in medieval economic history, where women's work often disappears from official documentation despite its critical importance to household economies. In rare cases, women operated forges independently, either as widows continuing their husbands' businesses or even more exceptionally as trained craftswomen in their own right. Historical records document a few female blacksmiths, particularly in urban areas during periods of labor shortage following the Black Death. These exceptional cases highlight both the general gender restrictions and the occasional flexibility of medieval economic structures when practical necessities demanded adaptations to usual patterns. Children's experiences in blacksmithing families varied significantly by gender. Sons received technical training that represented valuable economic capital, while daughters typically learned domestic management and business operations that, while essential, carried less independent economic value in medieval markets. This gendered division of knowledge transmission reflected and reinforced broader patterns of economic opportunity and constraint operating throughout medieval society. The blacksmith's household thus operated as both an economic unit and a training institution, transmitting not just technical skills but social position, business connections, and embodied knowledge across generations. The craft's demands shaped family structure, domestic architecture, inheritance patterns, and gender relations in distinctive ways, creating household arrangements optimized for the continuation of both the family line and the craft tradition. This integration of family life and professional practice created both strengths and vulnerabilities. The family unit provided essential support for a physically demanding profession, distributed labor across multiple capable individuals, and created mechanisms for knowledge transmission that allowed the craft to survive across generations despite limited written documentation. However, it also concentrated environmental hazards among family members, created potential exploitation of child labor, and limited individual choice in favor of collective continuity. As our exploration of the medieval blacksmith's world approaches its conclusion, we've seen how this essential craftsman navigated multiple dimensions of hardship and complexity. The physical toll of forge work gradually destroyed bodily health. The economic arrangements provided higher status than agricultural work but remained precarious and demanding. The domestic sphere, while offering essential support, itself became shaped by the forge's demands and limitations. In our final segment, we'll examine the broader historical significance of blacksmiths as technological innovators whose work laid foundations for later industrial developments. We'll also consider how the medieval blacksmith's experience illuminates larger patterns of pre-industrial labor and craft knowledge that challenge our often romanticized view of historical work. Finally, we'll reflect on what this exploration reveals about the relationship between technology, human bodies, and social organization across historical periods. Having examined the professional challenges, physical hardships, and domestic arrangements of medieval blacksmiths, let's now explore how their craft evolved through the medieval period and its broader significance in technological development. The blacksmith's work, while rooted in ancient traditions, was far from static. It adapted to changing societal needs, incorporated new knowledge, and laid crucial foundations for later industrial innovations. The evolution of blacksmithing technology throughout the medieval period reflects broader patterns of knowledge transmission, experimentation, and adaptation. From the early medieval era, roughly 500–1000 CE, through the high and late medieval periods, 1000 to 1500 CE, blacksmithing techniques became increasingly sophisticated, specialized, and effective. This evolution wasn't driven by theoretical scientific understanding, which remained limited, but by practical experimentation and refinement passed between generations of craftsmen. One of the most significant technological developments was the gradual improvement in furnace design. Early medieval forges were simple, relatively low temperature affairs that limited both the quantity of metal that could be processed and the types of transformations possible. By the late medieval period, larger, more efficient furnaces achieved higher temperatures, allowing for more complete transformation of raw materials and the production of more sophisticated alloys. These furnace improvements resulted from incremental practical refinements rather than theoretical breakthroughs. Smiths observed that certain arrangements produced better results, that specific construction techniques better retained heat, that particular fuel preparations yielded higher temperatures. Each small improvement, shared within the craft community and refined through practice, contributed to the gradual enhancement of this crucial technology. Similar patterns of incremental improvement applied to tools and techniques. The basic implements of blacksmithing, hammers, tongs, anvils, and various shaping tools, remained conceptually similar throughout the medieval period, but their specific designs evolved substantially. Hammer heads became better balanced for specific tasks, tongs more specialized for holding different shapes, anvils more precisely formed for particular applications. These refinements improved both the quality of finished products and the efficiency with which they could be produced. The incorporation of mechanical assistance represents another crucial technological evolution. Water power, increasingly harnessed for industrial purposes from the 12th century onward, transformed aspects of metalworking that had previously relied entirely on human muscle. Water-powered trip hammers, massive hammers raised by water wheel and dropped rhythmically onto metal, could perform heavy forging operations with greater force and consistency than manual hammering. Similarly, water-powered bellows maintained more consistent airflow to furnaces, achieving higher temperatures with less human effort. These mechanical innovations fundamentally changed the economics and physical demands of certain metalworking operations. Tasks that had previously required multiple strong workers could now be accomplished with fewer laborers operating mechanical equipment. Work that had been limited by human endurance could continue longer with mechanical assistance. Products that had been prohibitively expensive due to labor requirements became more accessible through more efficient production. However, these advancements were unevenly distributed across the metalworking landscape. The capital investment required for water-powered equipment restricted it primarily to larger operations near suitable water sources. Most village blacksmiths continued to rely primarily on manual methods well into the late medieval period and beyond. This created increasing economic stratification within the craft, with mechanized operations able to produce certain items more efficiently, while traditional smiths maintained advantages in customization, repair, and local accessibility. The materials available to blacksmiths also evolved throughout the medieval period. Early medieval smiths worked primarily with bloomery iron, a relatively impure form produced in small simple furnaces. This material contained significant slag inclusions, waste material that affected its strength and workability. Through improved furnace design and better understanding of material behavior, later medieval smiths produced progressively cleaner, more consistent metals that allowed for more reliable products. The increasing production of steel, iron with controlled carbon content, represents one of the most important material advances. While steel production existed in limited forms from ancient times, medieval blacksmiths gradually developed more reliable methods for controlling carbon content, particularly through the cementation process that diffused carbon into wrought iron to create steel. This material advancement dramatically improved the performance of tools, weapons, and other items requiring specific mechanical properties. The products blacksmiths created also evolved in complexity and specialization throughout the medieval period. Early medieval metalwork focused primarily on basic agricultural implements, simple weapons, and household necessities. By the late medieval period, specialized items proliferated: complex locks and keys, sophisticated weapons and armor, precision tools for other crafts, and elaborate decorative ironwork for architectural applications. This expansion of product range reflected both growing societal wealth that could support such specialization and the accumulated technical knowledge that made it possible. What's particularly remarkable about these technological developments is that they occurred without the framework of modern scientific understanding. Medieval blacksmiths knew nothing of metallurgical chemistry, crystalline structures, or the physics of material transformation as we understand them today. Their knowledge was empirical rather than theoretical, based on careful observation of what worked rather than understanding why it worked. This empirical approach, while limited in some ways, proved remarkably effective at developing practical solutions to technical challenges. The medieval blacksmith might not understand why steel hardened when quenched in water, or why certain alloys performed better for specific applications, but through careful observation and transmission of craft knowledge, they developed sophisticated practical understandings that produced increasingly effective materials and techniques. The blacksmith's role as a technological innovator extended beyond metalworking itself. As the creators of tools used by virtually every other craft and industry, blacksmiths enabled technological developments across medieval society. Improved agricultural implements increased food production. Better building tools enabled more ambitious architecture. More precise instruments supported advancements in other crafts from carpentry to leatherworking. The blacksmith thus served as a crucial node in networks of technological development and knowledge exchange. This broader impact highlights an important aspect of medieval technological development often overlooked in modern accounts: the interconnectedness of craft knowledge across seemingly separate domains. Improvements in one area enabled advancements in others through complex networks of tools, materials, and shared practical understanding. The blacksmith, working at the intersection of multiple craft traditions and supplying tools to diverse industries, played a particularly important role in this interdependent system of technological development. The blacksmith's technological contributions extended beyond the medieval period, laying crucial foundations for later industrial developments. Many core processes of early industrialization evolved directly from techniques refined in medieval forges. The blast furnace, essential to industrial-scale iron production, developed from medieval furnace designs. Mechanized hammers and rolling mills expanded on principles established with water-powered trip hammers. Even modern steel production builds on understanding initially developed through medieval experimentation. What's particularly significant about this technological continuity is that it challenges simplified narratives about historical progress. The Industrial Revolution didn't emerge from nowhere, but built upon centuries of incremental craft development and practical knowledge. The medieval blacksmith, working with limited theoretical understanding but sophisticated practical knowledge, represents an important link in this long chain of technological evolution. This perspective offers a valuable corrective to presentist biases in how we conceptualize historical technology. We often imagine pre-industrial craftsmen as primitive, using crude methods that were swept aside by superior modern approaches. The reality is far more complex. Medieval blacksmiths developed remarkably sophisticated techniques optimized for their specific contexts, techniques that in many cases were directly adapted rather than replaced by later industrial processes. The blacksmith's role as technological innovator came with little of the social recognition or economic reward we associate with innovation today. Unlike modern inventors, who might patent discoveries, or entrepreneurs who built businesses around new techniques, medieval smiths typically received minimal direct benefit from their innovations. Improvements in technique spread through craft networks, with little attribution or compensation for originators. The collective advancement of the craft, rather than individual recognition, drove technological development. This communal approach to innovation had both advantages and limitations. The open transmission of practical improvements allowed for relatively rapid adoption of effective techniques throughout craft networks. However, the lack of individual incentives for innovation or documentation may have slowed development compared to modern systems that specifically reward new discoveries. The medieval approach prioritized reliability and tradition while still allowing for incremental improvement, a different innovation model than our modern emphasis on disruption and rapid change. Beyond specific technological developments, the medieval blacksmith's contribution to broader economic and social patterns deserves consideration. As one of the earliest specialized crafts to separate fully from agricultural production, blacksmithing helped establish patterns of craft organization, knowledge transmission, and market relations that would expand to other sectors over time. The blacksmith's workshop, with its master-apprentice structure, specialized tools, and focus on producing for a market rather than direct use, represented an early template for craft production more generally. The guild system that governed urban blacksmithing from the high medieval period onward similarly established organizational patterns that influenced economic development more broadly. Guilds standardized training requirements, regulated product quality, managed market competition, and provided social support systems for members. These functions, while eventually superseded by other institutions, represented important early examples of formal economic organization beyond direct lordly control or simple market relations. Blacksmiths also contributed to economic development through their role in facilitating trade and transportation. By producing horseshoes, wagon fittings, ship components, and container hardware, they enabled the physical movement of goods throughout the medieval economy. By creating standardized weights, scales, and measuring devices, they supported more reliable commercial transactions. These contributions to economic infrastructure were essential to the gradual commercial expansion that characterized the high and late medieval periods. The blacksmith's craft also played an important role in military technology and, by extension, political developments. Improvements in weapons and armor influenced battlefield outcomes with significant political consequences. The ability to produce effective arms in quantity became an important factor in state power. Blacksmiths thus indirectly influenced political configurations through their contributions to military capability, creating another dimension of their broader historical significance. Looking at these varied contributions, technological, economic, military, and social, we gain a more nuanced understanding of how seemingly humble craft traditions shaped broader historical developments. The medieval blacksmith, despite working primarily at a local scale and with limited theoretical understanding, participated in larger patterns of technological and social change that eventually transformed European society, and through colonial expansion, much of the world. This broader historical significance, however, came at tremendous personal cost to the practitioners themselves. The physical disabilities, chronic illnesses, shortened lifespans, and social marginalization we've explored in previous sections were the lived reality behind these historical contributions. Each incremental improvement in technique or product quality represented countless hours of physical hardship, bodies gradually broken by the demands of the forge. This disconnect between historical significance and personal experience highlights an important aspect of how we conceptualize the past. Our understanding of historical developments often focuses on aggregated outcomes and broad patterns, while minimizing or ignoring the individual experiences that constituted those patterns. The blacksmith's technological contributions appear in our historical accounts. The blacksmith's chronic pain and respiratory disease typically do not. Recovering these embodied experiences requires different approaches and sources than traditional historical methods. Archaeological evidence, particularly the analysis of skeletal remains showing distinctive patterns of physical stress and damage, provides one window into these lived realities. Medical records, where they exist, offer another, though often filtered through the limited understanding of period practitioners. Visual representations, personal accounts, and even folklore contain additional clues about the physical experiences of historical work. When we integrate these varied sources with more traditional historical approaches, a more complete picture emerges, one that recognizes both the historical significance of craft traditions, like blacksmithing, and the human costs they imposed on practitioners. This integrated understanding offers valuable perspective on how technological and economic development has always been embodied in specific human experiences, often involving significant hardship alongside progress. This perspective has implications for how we think about our own technological moment. Modern technology, like its historical predecessors, comes with both benefits and costs, often distributed unevenly across populations. Just as medieval blacksmiths bore physical burdens that benefited broader society, contemporary technological systems create patterns of advantage and disadvantage, benefit and harm. Historical awareness of these patterns can inform more thoughtful engagement with our own technological choices and systems. The medieval blacksmith's experience also offers perspective on contemporary discussions about skill, craft knowledge, and different forms of understanding. The sophisticated practical knowledge developed by blacksmiths without theoretical scientific frameworks challenges simplistic hierarchies that privilege abstract understanding over embodied skill. Their accomplishments remind us that multiple forms of knowledge, theoretical and practical, abstract and embodied, have contributed to human development. As our exploration of medieval blacksmithing continues into our final segment, we'll examine how the profession changed during the transition from the medieval to early modern periods. We'll consider how the emerging scientific revolution, changing economic structures, and new technologies transformed aspects of the blacksmith's work, while leaving others remarkably consistent. We'll also reflect on how perceptions of the craft have evolved over time, from medieval attitudes through romantic reimaginings to contemporary understandings. These transitions and perceptions further illuminate the complex relationship between craft traditions, technological change, economic systems, and cultural values. The blacksmith, standing quite literally at the anvil of technological transformation, offers a uniquely valuable lens through which to view these broader historical patterns and their meaning for our understanding of both past and present relationships with technology and work. But before we move to those broader transitions, let's consider one more aspect of the medieval blacksmith's experience: the distinctive sensory world they inhabited. Beyond the physical demands and health impacts we've explored, blacksmithing created a unique sensory environment that shaped practitioners' experience in ways both subtle and profound. The forge engaged all senses intensely and continuously. Visually, blacksmiths observed subtle color changes in heated metal that indicated specific temperature ranges, from dark red through bright orange to yellow-white, each corresponding to different working properties. This constant visual attention to color gradients required tremendous focus and developed specialized perceptual abilities distinct from other crafts. Auditory experience was similarly specialized. The rhythmic hammering created not just noise but information. The sound of metal, striking metal, communicated crucial details about material properties and working progress to experienced ears. Different pitches and timbres indicated whether metal was properly heated, how it was responding to working, and when processes were complete. This auditory knowledge, developed through years of practice, represented another dimension of embodied craft understanding. Touch provided equally important information. Through the hammer and tongs, smiths felt how metal responded to working, its resistance, plasticity, and internal structure. This haptic knowledge couldn't be fully verbalized or written down, but was essential to effective practice. Temperature sensing became highly developed, with smiths able to judge the heat of metals and environments with remarkable precision through bodily experience. Smell contributed additional information. Different metals, alloys, and processes produced distinctive odors that provided feedback about material composition and chemical reactions. Some of these smells, particularly those involving toxic substances like arsenic or mercury, occasionally used in certain specialized processes, represented serious health hazards, but they also provided sensory information that guided practice. Even taste occasionally played a role in the blacksmith's sensory repertoire. Some traditional tests for metal composition or quality involved tasting small filings or touching the tongue to worked pieces, practices that provided useful information despite their health risks. This multisensory engagement with materials represented another dimension of embodied knowledge, largely lost in modern accounts, focused on the products rather than the process of historical craft. The unique sensory world of the forge likely shaped consciousness in ways that extended beyond technical practice. The rhythmic nature of many blacksmithing processes, regular hammer strikes, bellows pumping, repetitive movements, created patterns that some practitioners described as meditative or trance-like. Combined with the visual focus on fire and glowing metal, these rhythmic elements could produce altered states of consciousness that contributed to both the mystical associations of the craft and its potential psychological rewards despite physical hardship. This sensory immersion represents a largely lost dimension of historical experience that's difficult to recover through traditional historical methods. Yet it constituted a fundamental aspect of the blacksmith's lived reality, shaping perception, cognition, and identity in ways that transcended the simple economic function of the craft. Understanding these sensory dimensions adds another layer to our appreciation of how completely the profession defined its practitioner's existence. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through the medieval blacksmith's world, let's examine how this ancient craft transitioned into the early modern period and beyond. The shift from medieval to early modern society brought significant changes to virtually every aspect of European life, and blacksmithing was no exception. Yet alongside these transformations, remarkable continuities persisted in the daily practices and physical experiences of the craft. The period roughly spanning from 1450 to 1700 brought multiple developments that reshaped blacksmithing both gradually and profoundly. The emerging scientific revolution, while not immediately transforming craft practices, began establishing theoretical frameworks that would eventually complement and extend the empirical knowledge smiths had developed over generations. Early metallurgical treatises, like Vannocchio Biringuccio's Della Pyrotechnia, 1540, and Georgius Agricola's De Re Metallica, 1556, attempted to systematize understanding of metalworking processes that had previously been transmitted primarily through direct apprenticeship. These early scientific approaches to metallurgy didn't replace traditional craft knowledge. Indeed, they often simply documented existing practices, but they represented a significant shift in how such knowledge was conceptualized and transmitted. By recording techniques in writing and illustration, these works began transforming some aspects of metalworking knowledge from purely embodied skills to documented procedures that could be studied without direct mentorship. This shift would gradually alter patterns of knowledge transmission that had characterized the craft for centuries. Technological developments during this transitional period further transformed aspects of the blacksmith's work. Blast furnaces, larger, more efficient successors to medieval furnaces, enabled production of cast iron in greater quantities and with more consistent properties. These furnaces required greater capital investment and more elaborate infrastructure than traditional forges, accelerating the separation between iron production and the working of metal into finished products. This separation had profound implications for blacksmiths. Village smiths, who had previously worked with iron from relatively local sources, increasingly received their raw materials from more distant specialized production facilities. The metal itself changed, with cast iron becoming more common alongside the wrought iron and steel that had dominated medieval metalworking. These new materials required different handling techniques and created both challenges and opportunities for craftsmen accustomed to traditional materials. The gradual mechanization of aspects of metalworking continued and accelerated during this period. Water power, already harnessed for some operations in larger medieval facilities, became more widespread. Trip hammers, rolling mills, and mechanical shears reduced some of the most physically demanding aspects of metalwork. These developments benefited those with access to the necessary capital and water resources, while potentially threatening the livelihoods of those relying entirely on manual methods. Economic changes complemented and sometimes drove these technological developments. The growth of international trade networks expanded markets for some metalwork products, while introducing new competition for others. Increasing economic centralization under emerging nation-states created both opportunities through military contracts and infrastructure projects, and constraints through taxation and regulation. The guild system that had organized urban crafts during the medieval period faced growing challenges from alternative economic arrangements that prioritized scale and capital over traditional skill hierarchies. These transitions didn't occur uniformly across regions or specialties. Rural blacksmiths, particularly in less economically developed areas, might continue practices nearly identical to their medieval predecessors well into the 18th or even 19th centuries. Urban smiths experienced more rapid change, especially in regions with early industrial development. Specialized branches of metalworking, like gunsmithing, lockmaking, or toolmaking, developed at different rates according to market demands and technological possibilities. This uneven development created a landscape where multiple models of metalworking coexisted, sometimes in competition and sometimes in complementary relationships. A village blacksmith might repair agricultural implements produced in a larger, more mechanized facility. A specialized urban craftsman might create precision components using both traditional manual skills and newer mechanical assists. These varied adaptations demonstrate the resilience and flexibility of the craft tradition in responding to changing conditions. For individual practitioners, these transitions created both opportunities and challenges. Some blacksmiths successfully adapted to changing markets, incorporating new materials and techniques into their repertoire. Others struggled to compete with larger operations or to acquire the capital necessary for mechanization. The physical demands and health impacts remained significant, even as some processes became mechanically assisted. The fundamental hazards of heat, smoke, heavy materials, and repetitive motion continued regardless of economic arrangement. Social perceptions of blacksmithing also evolved during this transitional period. The mystical associations that had sometimes marked the craft in medieval popular imagination gradually declined with the growth of mechanical explanations for natural phenomena. The blacksmith's social status, while still above that of unskilled laborers, became less distinctive as other specialized crafts proliferated. The ambiguous position between common laborer and respected craftsman persisted, but within a more complex social hierarchy that offered additional paths to status and recognition. Religious dimensions of the craft similarly transformed. The Protestant Reformation altered or eliminated many traditional religious observances associated with craft guilds, including the celebration of patron saints like Eligius. In Protestant regions, the relationship between spiritual and craft identity shifted toward a more individualized calling rather than collective religious observance. This change potentially isolated practitioners further by removing some traditional sources of community and shared identity. These various transitions, technological, economic, social, and religious, culminated in the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, which fundamentally reorganized metalworking along with most other productive activities. Large-scale factory production gradually replaced individual craft workshops for many metal goods. Mass production techniques standardized products that had previously reflected individual makers' styles and decisions. The division of labor fragmented what had been integrated craft knowledge into specialized tasks requiring less comprehensive training. The blacksmith, once essential to virtually every community, became increasingly marginalized in industrializing regions. Some smiths found niches in repair work, custom production, or specialized applications where mass production proved impractical. Others transitioned into industrial employment, applying elements of their craft knowledge within factory settings. Many, particularly in rural areas with limited economic alternatives, struggled to maintain viability as cheaper mass-produced goods undercut their market position. Yet, even as traditional blacksmithing declined as an economic force, it developed new cultural significance. The very marginalization of the craft contributed to its romanticization in art, literature, and popular imagination. The village blacksmith became a symbol of pre-industrial virtue, honest labor, and authentic craftsmanship in contrast to impersonal industrial production. This symbolic role, while offering little practical benefit to working smiths, helped preserve aspects of the craft tradition through periods of economic decline. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Village Blacksmith, 1840, exemplifies this romanticized portrayal. The smith appears as a figure of moral virtue and physical strength, with large and sinewy hands, that the muscles of his brawny arms are strong as iron bands. The physical toll of the work receives positive framing as character building rather than debilitating. The smith becomes a symbol of stability and traditional values during a period of rapid social change. His brow is wet with honest sweat. He earns whate'er he can, and looks the whole world in the face, for he owes not any man. This romanticized image, while capturing elements of the blacksmith's social role and physical presence, obscures the harsh realities we've explored throughout our journey. The chronic respiratory illnesses, the progressive damage to joints, the shortened lifespan, the economic precarity. The symbolic blacksmith, preserved in 19th century literature and art, embodies cultural values rather than historical reality, representing what industrial society believed it had lost rather than the complex lived experience of actual historical craftsmen. This gap between cultural representation and historical reality persists in contemporary perceptions of historical blacksmithing. Popular media depictions, in films, television, and historical reenactments, typically emphasize the dramatic and visually compelling aspects of the craft, while minimizing its physical toll and health impacts. The blacksmith appears as a figure of impressive skill and strength, rather than a person gradually damaged by their occupation. The forge becomes a site of artistic creation, rather than slow physical destruction. This selective memory reflects broader patterns in how we conceptualize historical labor and craft. We preserve artifacts of remarkable skill and beauty in museums, appreciating their aesthetic and technical qualities while rarely considering the human cost of their production. We admire the products of historical crafts without fully acknowledging the bodies broken in their making. This partial view creates distorted understanding of historical work and its relationship to our contemporary labor practices. Archaeological evidence provides an important corrective to these romanticized portrayals. The physical remains of blacksmiths tell a different story. Skeletons with distinctive patterns of wear and damage, evidence of respiratory disease and heavy metal exposure, signs of premature aging and disability. These material traces reveal aspects of the craft's reality that literary and artistic representations often neglect, offering silent testimony to the bodily cost of historical production. This archaeological perspective aligns with accounts from practitioners of traditional blacksmithing techniques in contemporary settings. Modern smiths, working with traditional methods, frequently report similar physical impacts to those documented in historical records: respiratory difficulties, joint pain, hearing damage, and eye strain. Even with improved ventilation, protective equipment, and medical understanding, the fundamental physical challenges of the craft remain significant. This continuity across centuries highlights how deeply the physical demands of metalworking are embedded in its basic processes. The survival of traditional blacksmithing into the contemporary period offers unique opportunities to understand aspects of historical experience that written records alone cannot capture. The sensory dimensions of the craft, the feel of properly heated metal, the sound of effective hammer strikes, the visual cues of temperature and material condition, remain remarkably consistent despite technological changes. Modern practitioners accessing these sensory experiences can connect with elements of historical craft knowledge that transcend textual documentation. Contemporary blacksmithing has evolved into multiple distinct but related forms. Some practitioners focus on historical reproduction, recreating techniques and products from specific historical periods with careful attention to period-appropriate methods. Others work in architectural or artistic contexts, creating decorative ironwork that builds on traditional techniques while incorporating contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. Still others apply traditional forging methods to modern applications in custom toolmaking or specialized industrial contexts. In each of these contemporary forms, elements of the historical craft persist alongside significant adaptations. The fundamental process of shaping hot metal through controlled hammering remains central. The embodied knowledge of material properties and proper handling techniques continues to be transmitted primarily through direct mentorship and practice, rather than textual instruction. The physical interaction between craftsmen, material, and tool maintains remarkably consistent patterns despite changes in surrounding technology and economic context. This persistence highlights an important aspect of craft traditions that purely technological or economic analyses often miss: their cultural coherence and internal logic. Blacksmithing represents not just a set of technical procedures for transforming metal, but a coherent system of knowledge, values, and practices that has maintained recognizable continuity despite centuries of external change. The core identity of the craft has proven remarkably resilient, even as its economic position and social meaning have transformed dramatically. Understanding this cultural coherence helps explain why traditional crafts like blacksmithing have experienced revivals during periods of rapid technological change. The arts and crafts movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries explicitly positioned traditional craftsmanship, including metalwork, as an alternative to industrial production and its perceived aesthetic and social limitations. Similar revivals have occurred during subsequent periods of technological acceleration, including our current digital age, as people seek tangible embodied experiences to counterbalance increasingly abstracted and virtual modes of production and interaction. These revival movements, while sometimes romanticizing pre-industrial work, also preserve valuable knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Techniques developed through centuries of practical refinement often contain insights that purely theoretical approaches might miss. The blacksmith's intuitive understanding of metal behavior, developed through physical engagement rather than mathematical modeling, represents a form of knowledge complementary to rather than superseded by scientific analysis. Preserving these alternative approaches to understanding materials enriches our collective technological capabilities. This perspective suggests a more nuanced view of technological development than simplistic narratives of linear progress. Rather than seeing traditional crafts as primitive precursors to superior modern methods, we might understand them as different but equally sophisticated approaches to working with materials, each with particular strengths, limitations, and embodied wisdom. The medieval blacksmith's knowledge, while lacking modern theoretical frameworks, represented a highly refined understanding of materials and processes optimized for specific contexts and constraints. This more balanced assessment applies equally to how we understand the physical experience of craft work. While we've emphasized the harsh realities and health impacts of historical blacksmithing throughout our exploration, we should also acknowledge the potential psychological rewards that accompanied this physically demanding work. The deep engagement with materials, the development of specialized perceptual abilities, the tangible results of skilled labor, and the social recognition of mastery all provided compensations that partially balanced the physical hardships. Modern research on the psychology of craft and manual work suggests these benefits are significant. The state of focused attention that craftspeople enter when fully engaged in skilled work, sometimes called flow, provides documented psychological benefits, including reduced anxiety and increased sense of meaning and purpose. The direct connection between intention and result, the tactile feedback of materials, and the visible progress toward completion all contribute to psychological well-being in ways that more abstracted forms of labor often lack. These psychological dimensions likely applied to historical blacksmiths as well, though their experience would have been shaped by different cultural frameworks and expectations. The medieval smith might not have conceptualized their engaged concentration as flow, or their satisfaction in skilled work as self-actualization, but the underlying psychological mechanisms would have operated nonetheless. These positive aspects of craft experience, alongside social status and economic advantages relative to agricultural labor, help explain why individuals continue to enter the profession despite its physical costs. Understanding this complex balance of hardship and reward, physical toll and psychological benefit, provides a more complete picture of historical craft experience than either purely negative or romanticized portrayals. The medieval blacksmith endured objectively harsh conditions by modern standards, while simultaneously developing sophisticated skills, creating objects of practical and sometimes aesthetic value, and maintaining an essential place in their community's economic and technological systems. This contradiction, suffering alongside achievement, characterizes much of historical human experience. As we conclude our journey through the medieval blacksmith's world, we've seen how this essential craftsman navigated multiple dimensions of experience: the physical demands of the forge, the economic challenges of craft production, the social complexities of their intermediate status, the technological opportunities and constraints of their time, and the psychological balance between hardship and meaning. This integrated understanding reveals the blacksmith not as a simple figure of either virtuous labor or exploited worker, but as a fully human participant in complex historical systems. The blacksmith story illuminates broader patterns in how work, technology, bodies, and social systems have interacted throughout history. The physical impacts of labor, the embodied nature of skill, the relationship between technological change and social organization, the tension between innovation and tradition. All these themes extend beyond blacksmithing to inform our understanding of historical experience more generally. By examining them through the specific lens of this essential craft, we gain insights applicable to many other contexts. These insights have relevance for contemporary questions about technology, labor, and human experience, As automated systems and artificial intelligence increasingly transform work processes previously requiring human skill, we face questions about the value of embodied knowledge, the relationship between efficiency and human well-being, and the social impacts of technological change that parallel those encountered in earlier transitions. The blacksmith's experience at the boundary between medieval and industrial production systems offers valuable perspective on these ongoing transformations. Similarly, growing awareness of the health impacts of contemporary work arrangements, from repetitive stress injuries in office settings to chemical exposures in manufacturing, echoes issues that have accompanied human labor throughout history. The blacksmith's struggle with occupational illness reminds us that the physical impact of work has always been unevenly distributed, with those performing essential production often bearing disproportionate bodily costs for broader social benefit. This historical pattern continues in new forms today, raising ethical questions about how we balance productivity with human health. The persistence of traditional blacksmithing, alongside industrial and post-industrial production systems, demonstrates that older technologies need not disappear entirely when newer alternatives emerge. Different technological approaches can coexist, each finding appropriate applications according to specific requirements and values. This pattern suggests that our current technological transitions need not proceed as simple replacement of human skills with automated alternatives, but might instead develop as complementary systems leveraging the distinctive capabilities of both human craft knowledge and computational processing. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you'll spare a thought for those medieval craftsmen whose lives we've explored tonight. They stood at their anvils day after day, year after year, enduring heat and smoke, gradually sacrificing their health to produce the metal tools, weapons, and implements that their communities required. Their individual stories of apprenticeship and mastery, of bodily knowledge and physical decline, of essential service and social ambiguity, have largely disappeared from historical record, preserved only in archaeological remains and generalized accounts. Yet their collective impact remains visible in the technological foundations they established, in the craft traditions they maintained and developed, and in the physical infrastructure they helped create. The medieval blacksmith, through daily labor at the forge, contributed to technological and economic systems that would eventually transform into our modern industrial world. Their embodied knowledge, transmitted through generations of direct mentorship, preserved and refined the material understanding that later scientific approaches would systematize and extend. The next time you encounter an artifact of historical metalwork, perhaps displayed in a museum, featured in historical media, or preserved in an ancient building, remember the hands that shaped it. Remember the eyes strained by forge light, the lungs damaged by smoke and metal dust, the joints worn by repetitive motion. Remember the years of apprenticeship, the accumulated wisdom of material properties, the skilled judgment of temperature and timing. Remember the full humanity of historical workers whose physical sacrifice created objects that outlasted their creators by centuries. This more complete remembering honors the complexity of historical experience beyond simplified narratives of either romanticized craft virtue or exploitative labor conditions. It recognizes the medieval blacksmith as neither hero nor victim, but as a person navigating specific historical constraints with remarkable skill and inevitable limitations. It acknowledges both the genuine achievements of pre-industrial craft knowledge and the real physical cost at which that knowledge was developed and applied. As the hammer falls quiet and the forge fire dims, we leave the medieval blacksmith to continue their essential work across the centuries, shaping hot metal, crafting needed implements, and gradually trading health for livelihood in the flickering light of the forge. Their story, with all its hardship and skill, suffering and accomplishment, reminds us of the embodied reality behind every historical artifact and the human cost embedded in all material production. Sleep well, knowing that the metal objects we take for granted today, from precision tools to building hardware, from cooking implements to vehicle components, descend from traditions developed through countless hours of skilled labor at forges much like those we've explored tonight. The medieval blacksmith's legacy lives on in these objects, and in the metallurgical understanding they help develop, a quiet testament to the enduring impact of their physically demanding but essential craft.